podcaster who founded the Interdependence Project, a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to secular Buddhist practice and transformational activism and the arts. He is also an avid yoga practitioner, and he has been featured on CNN, NPR, ABC, Yahoo News, on, and elsewhere to discuss Buddhism and meditation. And praise for the Dharma of the Princess Bride that came from the Los Angeles Review of Books, Publishers Weekly, and the New York Times, which said of the book, quote, "It defies easy categorization, part memoir, part Buddhist treatise, and part cultural criticism. Its pitch is that The Princess Bride is something more than a lighthearted send-up of the fairy tale genre. If viewed through the right lens, it is also a trove of timeless wisdom." So, with no further ado, please help me give a warm welcome to Ethan Nichtern. Ethan, glad you're here.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's really, it's here now in the Zoom era means in my apartment, but I'm glad to be here too. And I'm really glad to be speaking to an audience in Arkansas, because that's where my family's from, even though I'm from New York. My mother grew up in the town of Stuttgart, Arkansas, and still have a lot of family there, and have spent quite a lot of summers on the White River. So thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no, I was amazed when I read that you had mentioned having family in Arkansas. I had absolutely no idea until I got really into the book. So it's nice to have you back here, sort of back in Arkansas with us to join us. And you're currently in Brooklyn, right?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
I am.
Well, before we getting into questions, I've got lots of questions. I'm sure our participants are going to be sending me questions. I wanted to give you a chance to read an excerpt from the book that you thought might be helpful to sort of set the stage for our discussion.
Sure. And I really do, in this case, like what the New York Times said, that it is an attempt to use love of pop culture to create both a memoir and a book on some take on what Buddhist philosophy has to do with relationships. So I just thought I'd read the first few pages or a few excerpts from the introduction. And I apologize for having a Band-Aid on my chin. I had a little trip and fall yesterday. So if that's distracting for anyone, I do apologize.
No, it's great.
Hello, my name is Ethan Nichtern. The six-fingered man was my father's best friend. Prepare to read. David Nichtern and Christopher Guest were born 2 weeks apart and grew up together in downtown New York City. Christopher was not yet a diabolical villain with an extraneous digit, nor one of the greatest comedic actors of his time. David was not yet a Buddhist, nor a Buddhist teacher. What they shared was an urban childhood and a love of making music, bluegrass mostly, more or less the hip hop of kids from the village in the early 1960s. In their friendship, Chris was never the sadistic Count Rugen. Instead, he played a part more like Andre the Giant's Fezzik, defending my father against playground bullies. I've heard many stories of their swashbuckling together, like Inigo Montoya and the Dread Pirate Roberts, unsheathing guitars instead of swords. They moved through city adventures from west to east, from Waverly Place to Stuyvesant Town, having fun, storming castles, being kids. Christopher's role in The Princess Bride was the reason I was excited to see the movie when it was first released in the fall of 1987. I was 9 years old. All I knew was that this man I had known all my life played a bad guy, a hilarious idea in itself, and that the movie was a kind of fairy tale, but not just any fairy tale. Even upon first viewing it, I knew the film was a parody. It felt like a sarcastic Xerox of the fairy tale genre, as if a smart older kid were making fun of some cheesy story I'd already seen 1,000 times. I remember enjoying the movie the first time. It displaced my troubled mind into humor and fantasy during a particularly rough stretch of my childhood, a year-long span that included my parents' difficult divorce, my grandparents' double suicide, and like a candle torched at both ends, the premature death of my parents' Buddhist teacher, the man who exerted a central gravitational pull in the galaxy of their lives, and later mine, the brilliant and enigmatic Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Going to see The Princess Bride that first time was a great escape. In it were swashbuckling friends, ridiculous villains, and a valiant quest for the love of a lady with a very strange name. More important, there was a grandfather using this wacky tale to comfort his grandson, almost exactly my age, on a sick day from school. Because I wanted to stay in bed and play Nintendo for most of fourth grade, I could easily relate. Much of the movie's existential brilliance was lost on me, though. I was just looking to escape, escape my parents fighting, escape the indecipherable popularity contest at school, escape the truth of my suffering, and maybe escape this version of Earth altogether. I liked the movie's goofy action. It was a story with just a few, but not too many, quote, kissing parts. As I grew older, I kept returning to the movie again and again. Across 3 decades of growing up, a process of maturation that now, even after decades of studying and teaching Buddhism, may still just be getting underway. Many other people I know went through a similar process with The Princess Bride. As the movie aged, and as those of us who are the grandson, Fred Savage's age, grew up or tried to, it caught on and became enshrined as an irrefutable staple of Generation X culture. The mixology-obsessed cocktail bar down the block from my Brooklyn apartment serves a mezcal-based drink, though brandy would be more appropriate, called the Inigo Montoya. The glass even comes with a toothpick sword across the rim, exacting heroic revenge against a 6-section slice of orange. The bar is one of many establishments I've been to that reference the movie on their menus. In 2015, the statistical website 538.com conducted a survey of the 25 most rewatchable movies of all time, ever. The Princess Bride was number 6. Among a particularly large swath of the population, a population that shares a wounded optimism about our society's ability to experience true love and a rapier-quick sense of irony, the movie is surely number 1. It is full of so many popular one-liners that whenever it's mentioned, people trip over themselves to choose which line to quote, hoping the person they are talking to doesn't know the story quite as well as they do. More often than not, they are wrong.
Thank you. I love that. There's so many things in there I would love to point out. And again, I just want to quickly remind people, if you have a question, drop it in the chat box, and I promise we'll get to it intermittently as we kind of talk. Again, thank you, Ethan, for reading that. You know, when I was honored enough to be asked to moderate the discussion, I went back and watched the movie again, because I probably hadn't seen it, I'm guessing, maybe 5 years ago. I have a 20-year-old son. I probably watched with it when he was maybe 12 or so, 13, somewhere like that, and fell in love with it again, of course, and then watched it recently, fell in love with it again. And it's so amazing how at different periods of your life you watch it and you see something new and something different. Mm-hmm. Like I realized that I identified, because of my age, I'm a little older than you, I'm in my mid-50s, I've got to hesitate to even say that, but like I identified more with the grandfather than the grandson. I remember when the first time I watched it, when it first came out, or there closely thereafter, I identified as the grandson. Mm-hmm. And now it's like I'm getting closer to the grandfather age. And it's just amazing to me how it speaks to so many different generations, which actually is my first question I was going to ask you, is given the fact that it's so revered in pop culture. It's just on all these lists, top 25, top 50, you know, the National Film Registry, it was inducted to the National Film Registry. Did you at some point go, oh my God, I need to be careful about what I say about this iconic movie because it's so revered by people? Did you ever think, I'm really walking into, you know, the pit of despair or the fire trap, you know, in a way, like I'm going to get caught here by putting myself out there talking about this iconic movie, and people are going to be upset about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you know, in the era of social media and as a writer and as anybody, you know, I call myself a medium-sized fish in a small pond. There's always that, you know, you're going to get called out for all kinds. I mean, there's just a lot of sweet little trolls on the internet to practice loving kindness meditation towards. So no, but I mean, I knew that it was revered and I wanted to do a good job with it. So there were a couple of like sort of seed thoughts that this book came from. One was that the publisher who published my first book, One City, which was a small Buddhist publisher called Wisdom, they had just published, and I think it was one of their most popular books of all time, a book called The Dharma of Star Wars, which was kind of reading the Jedi code through a Buddhist lens. And so, you know, same thing, you know, when somebody else does that, I'm a fan of Star Wars too, as a lot of people are, and you're like, yeah, did they do this really? Did they do this as well? And so, but I wanted to, because the last book I had written was kind of a straightforward overview of Buddhism, you know, from the kind of Tibetan, but very modernized sense, the road home. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do a little bit more. I'm always kind of a more creative writer when I'm thinking about myself. So I really wanted to write a book about relationships, and so that brought in, but I didn't want to write a book as a relationship expert because, as I say, that there is actually no such thing as a relationship expert.
Right.
To be in relationship to others is actually an act of giving up our expertise. So this allowed me to bring in a little bit of memoir piece around having my subjective experience in the movie. And I thought if I stuck to that, I wouldn't, there was cultural criticism. And I got to have a few conversations. I got to talk to Christopher Guest about about the movie and about this book. I got to talk to Mandy Patinkin for about an hour and a half, and that was a really amazing conversation. And I read Carrie Ellis's, which is, I think, if you really want it, if you're like a super nerdy Princess Bride fan, that's a much better book to read, And a few of the like online comments I got about my book were, this is very well written, but it's more Dharma than the Princess Bride. And I was like, well, yeah, I mean,
that's the point.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I did want to do it justice. And the other piece of it is to really look at like every spiritual tradition actually comes of age in a cultural context, and it's not like things do not, I mean, spiritual teachings exist timelessly in a way, right? Like when you look at something like Buddhism, like the original things that the founder of the tradition said in a completely different world era, living a completely different life with a completely different personality maybe than I have or you have, they still resonate in some way. But at the same time, if you want to understand how the story of like the Buddha, for example, is told, there's actually a cultural context of storytelling there. And I think, the thing about The Princess Bride is it's about friendship. It's about romance and partnership and sort of a send up on this idea of like romantic saviors or, finding your one true love. And that's why the one true love is named Princess Buttercup, and then it's about this, amazingly touching interaction between a grandfather and his grandson. So, but the thing that I really love, because I think we live in a very postmodern era, and I say this later on, is The Princess Bride is such a good narrative because somehow it completely embraces the genre of fairy tale while completely making fun of it. And I've never seen anything else like that. Maybe a few Wes Anderson movies or something like that, but to actually be completely making fun of something and at the same time completely celebrating it, there's not a lot that does that. And I think that also is kind of very Buddhist in a way, to actually honor something while dismantling it, Yeah,
no, I totally agree. And I think that's one thing that's interesting. Like when you watch it when you're younger, you just see that at a surface level, sort of it's a fairy tale, these idealized versions of relationships and ideas of being a man and a woman and all this kind of stuff. And then you get older and you get more, it's mockery. They're sort of mocking it a little bit. Oh, I get it. They're sort of mocking it a little bit. And then I think there's even another level, maybe closer as you get older, you see the wisdom of it. Oh, they're not just mocking it, because mockery can be hurtful, can be mean-spirited. You're poking fun at something, but it's more than just sort of mocking it to me. There's that level, and you helped really bring it out in the book, is sort of a real wisdom. And that's where I think it's great for those of you who haven't rewatched it again. I mean, obviously read Ethan's book, but also rewatch the movie, especially if you're over 40 or 45 or older, man. I think it's just so interesting to watch it now from a different perspective. And I was going to ask you too, because, and you sort of answered it, but this idea of, there's this idea in The Princess Bride about idealistic relationships, idealistic people. There's all this sense of sort of surface. But in Buddhism, we try and view things as they really are, as they really, truly are. So how do you see The Princess Bride helping us to understand? On the surface, there's this idealistic fairy tale stuff going on, but actually it's helping us to see things as they really are.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the way I treat that in the section of the book that's on, romance and so forth, what I think, and I think this is really interesting to think about, is that Buddhism, Chogyam Trungpa very clearly defined Buddhism as what he called a non-theistic tradition. And this is really interesting, and especially talking to an audience in the South, that's a very interesting concept.
Yeah.
He was very clear to distinguish non-theistic from atheistic. The way he defined theism is it could take any form, but the idea is that it's a quest for somebody or something to save us, rather than to be able to do reflective work, learn about, exactly as you said, the way things are, who we are. And it's not at all, I think, when you define non-theism that way, it's not at all actually opposed to God or a creator God. It's really about how we look for external saviors because we feel like we are not enough. And I think the Princess Buttercup thing is a send up of how much we look for, and especially the rom-com or the fairy tale, we actually look for, like, if I find the one true love, he, she, they is going to save me from like actually having to be alone or having to, feel that longing, etc. So I think that's the interesting, in terms of, and that's something I, really struggled with a lot in my romantic life, liking this movie over the, 30-year stretch between when I first saw it and when this book was published, to really try to come to terms with sort of, and I think we all struggle with this sort of, what is the relationship between, in romance, accepting things as they are and wanting some ideal, wanting that sort of like Princess Buttercup or, Prince Charming, or, could be a non-binary
right.
person as well. And I think it's really, I kept coming back to this movie because it's so fun. It's like, you do want to find your prince or your Prince Charming or your Princess Buttercup. And at the same time, the whole thing is like, the whole concept is ridiculous. It's never going to happen. You aren't actually going to ride off into the sunset. You're going to have something that is real, and finding love through what is actually real, and I think that's, the way the movie actually ends, I think, really nails that, because it brings it back to the family love and the family lineage. And the refrain of "as you wish," as this devotional love, is actually the last thing that the grandfather says to the grandson. And so this "as you wish" phrasing of like how to be devoted, genuinely devoted, and feel love that's not about like grasping or idealism or salvation, but is very just direct and human. I think it really nails it. And that makes me cry also, because my grandfather and his second wife committed suicide the same year that the movie came out. So that sort of notion of and I talk about that the last time I saw my grandfather, but that sort of notion of the familial love, which is a very different kind of love from romantic love. But I think working with things as they are, that's the thing. We need stories to long for something more, right? I think we actually need the fairy tale. We need superhero. Like, you think about the world we live in culturally, like the fantastical escapism, like Marvel characters and, the Avengers and like all these comic book characters, like everybody needs kind of heroic saints or bodhis. Every culture needs sort of something to yearn for and reach for. But at the same time, the point of that is it should help us live our human life more fully, and more directly, as you're saying.
Yeah. You mentioned I was going to ask you about this because you talk about what happened to your granddad and your step grandma, I guess, right? And
yes,
the tragedy of that when you were young, and I think the divorce, your parents' divorce. And I know in my own personal case, and a lot of the people that I talk to who have followed sort of a Buddhist path, much of it began in some kind of a trauma early, whether it's childhood or teenage years, early adulthood. For me, really more early adulthood, but some were a confluence of circumstances, of traumatic circumstances, push us towards this path. So would you say that for you, that was true, that what happened with your grandparents and your parents' divorce and perhaps other things, that's what put you on this path of being curious about Buddhism?
For sure. And having parents who are Buddhist. It's interesting. That's sort of loss, right? Often say like, Chogyam Trungpa's probably most famous student is the author and teacher Pema Chodron, and very, very, very well known. And her, I have a friend who kind of hilariously and ironically calls her the Buddhist gateway drug, Pema Chodron. So,
sorry, I didn't mean to laugh so loud about that. If you've ever read any, you have not read Pema Chodron, I would strongly suggest you do that. That's really funny.
Yeah. And her most popular book is called When Things Fall Apart. So there's clearly this notion of like when, and that's in Buddhism, the first noble truth is the truth of some kind of dissatisfaction, right? Some kind of inability to hold everything together and find the ideal, like some kind of loss or fracturing of what we thought life was kind of starts a quest to look deeper into our mind, into our heart, into the world. And so, yeah, I mean, there's always that that moment, and yeah, this was, I mean, it's interesting because it came a little bit later on. Like I was always somewhat interested in Buddhism. Like there was a class for kids when I was like 9 or 10 that I attended. That I remember I had asthma as a child, so the girl behind me told me I was breathing too loud, and but it definitely planted a seed. And then, you know, all the things that happened this year, my parents' Buddhist teacher died very prematurely. You know, he was a really brilliant man, but a super complex figure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my grandfather and step grandmother, there was a lot of complexity there. My parents who were two Buddhists. You know, if you want to judge, we get judged a lot. You know, I was saying that, like, the way to get to judge a Buddhist is just to say, that's not very Buddhist of you, you know.
Right, that's true. Yes.
I've gotten that a lot in my life. And so when my parents had a difficult divorce, that was my, like, you know, my internal feeling was probably like, that's not very Buddhist of you, you know.
Right.
And so it was when I was in high school, about, you know, 5 years later, that I really started reading a lot of Buddhist books. I like to kind of argue philosophically in my head. And I felt like it left a lot of space for you to contemplate, argue. And then towards the end of high school, I started, you know, meditating regularly. I wouldn't tell my parents I was doing it at first. And then in college, basically what happened is had my first major girlfriend freshman year of college, and she dumped me, went back to Los Angeles, got back together with her high school boyfriend over the summer. And that's when I really embraced Buddhism. That was my when things fall apart, you know?
Yes. I could relate to that. I think a lot of us get relationship breakups, divorce, yes.
Yeah.
That, boy, you have to take a good, long, hard look at things as they really are.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to ask something about the fairy tale kind of idea, because you know, as you're well aware, sometimes people, the one criticism you might hear about The Princess Bride is sort of this patriarchal kind of thing, like the only female character really is Buttercup, and there's all these other female, I mean, Valerie, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And she's very sort of, I don't know, you know, I don't want to get too film student-y here, right? And sort of dissecting characters too much, right? You know, how three-dimensional of a character Buttercup is. There's more time spent on the male characters and Wesley a little bit. But is there any thoughts about that? Sort of the patriarchal, I mean, when they made this movie, or the story, Goldman first wrote the book and then they made it into a movie. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is incredibly patriarchal. And I was talking with a friend about, like, if you go back, you know, if you go through, you know, what's happened in the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, if you go reread the culture, like most of the things that were done and popular in the 80s, 90s, and even like a decade ago would not pass muster now, you know.
Right.
And I would love to read the version of The Princess Bride that was written by a woman, you know, and sort of see what that looks like, because but it could just be as easily be, you know, it could be Prince Buttercup, you know. I mean, right. There is a patriarchal quality, but there's also the idealization can go anyway, you know, with any kind of romantic directionality or any kind of fixation on desire of wanting to get the perfect situation, the perfect partner, the perfect prince or princess. So yeah, no, it's definitely a shortcoming. I mean, it's interesting because it's not this is not one of the texts that, I listen to a lot of feminists. I have a lot of feminist friends. The Princess Bride, it seems like it has a hallowed place in a lot of people's minds. So this is not one of the texts or movies that people are going back and being like, oh my God, this was so problematic, et cetera. But yeah, it is in the ways you talked about, but it seems to capture enough innocently about the human spirit that, it's a nice, even though it's flawed, and it would be nice to see more fairy tales that kind of invert all the power dynamics. It's still pretty widely revered.
Yeah, I agree. And by the way, I'm being reminded here too that after this session, 5:00 Central, when it ends, there's a free screening of The Princess Bride that you can watch, and it's been dropped in the chat there for anyone. And also you can purchase Ethan's book to via the link that's in the chat. So don't forget about that. I was going to say, Miracle Max and Valerie. I think in your book at one point you mentioned that in some ways they're like the best example of a relationship, which I love Billy Crystal's Miracle Max, and I forgot who plays Valerie. But it's such a good, say a little bit about that, how that relationship to you in many ways is like a healthy relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only, so Valerie, you're absolutely right, is other than the old woman in the dream screaming at Princess Buttercup,
oh, that's right,
when she settles for marrying Humperdinck. That's really the only woman character, and Carol Kane, and she's, amazing. But if you look at it, that is the example of a successful long-term relationship, is this sort of screaming. She calls him out about how he's lost confidence, right? So there's a lot of really good feedback, a lot of like tough tenderness, and it's hilarious to say that because they're like kind of yelling at each other, but there's something very human about their interaction I was thinking about that actually, because I did get to, talk to Mandy Patinkin about this through a friend before I wrote the book. And then if anybody here follows Mandy Patinkin on like Twitter or, his Instagram, well, it's him and his wife are like kind of like Miracle Max and Valerie, actually. That's a great point. Even though it's Billy Crystal. And when I talked to Mandy Patinkin, he was giving his wife so much credit. Mandy Patinkin does meditate. He's a Zen meditator. But he was giving his wife all the credit for getting him into that. So, it's interesting, like what actually makes people stay together in the long run. It's either a sense of duty and obligation, or there's something that both of them get out of it that doesn't always look, like the fairy tale, and probably usually does not look like the fairy tale. It looks like love, right? I mean, Valerie very clearly loves Miracle Max, but it's like a bickering, crazy, neurotic. So I think there's something very real and human about that. But that is the only model in Princess Bride for a successful long-term relationship. We never really get to see Fred Savage's parents. We meet his mother for a moment, but we don't like that's all we have in The Princess Bride. And it's interesting because it does remind me of Mandy Patinkin and his wife, at least how they show up on social media these days.
I've forgotten about Mandy Patinkin's TikTok. I think it's like a TikTok account and an Instagram account. Yeah, it's really great. The Wesley pirate, oh my gosh, I forgot his name in the story now. Dread Pirate Roberts.
The Dread Pirate Roberts.
Pirate Roberts, yeah, I was trying to get the phrase correctly. Man in Black, Wesley, Barn Boy, etc. Right? So there's this evolution of his character a little bit, and it made me think too of Joseph Campbell's book, Hero with a Thousand Faces. Mm-hmm. Right, which is very much about storytelling, and Buddhism. You even mentioned this in your book. Buddhism is storytelling, mm-hmm. right? And so here, and so is mythology, and much of what we call religion and spirituality is based in storytelling. And here's this character, this hero character, Wesley, that evolves as the movie goes on. What do you have a sense of? Do you sort of see in that same way that he is sort of this iconic hero character who has to learn a lesson. Like he goes off, he disappears, who knows where he goes. He disappears for years. We have no idea what happens to him. He meets the Dread Pirate Roberts. He goes into, has all this crap happen to him. He sort of is like a hero character.
Yeah, he's very much a hero character. And it reminds me particularly the sort of evolution of this sort of being called the Dread Pirate Roberts. It reminds me of some of these ancient stories about how Buddhist students were trained by their teachers or masters under very austere and difficult circumstance where they would have to give up everything. Dread Pirate Roberts says to Wesley over these 5 years, "I'll probably kill you tomorrow."
Right.
But then he lets him live another day, trains him, and then eventually he lets him take on the moniker, like carry the mantle or the lineage, we might say, from a Buddhist standpoint, of being the Dread Pirate Roberts. And all of a sudden, I mean, he's still Wesley, he's still in love with Buttercup, but he's this person who's like developed a level of fearlessness and warriorship, from a Buddhist standpoint. And it was all through sort of basically facing complete impermanence every day. And then I love that the old Dread Pirate Roberts wasn't the original Dread Pirate Roberts either. So the Dread Pirate Roberts is almost this stand-in for like completely facing the truth of death. And it just reminded me kind of some of these stories of how Buddhist masters are trained, and in at least classic Asian or Zen or Tibetan, stories. And it's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, reminding people, drop something in the chat if you have a question for Ethan. Someone wanted me to remind that the movie Ever After is that kind of a story told through the eyes of a woman. Although maybe I've seen the movie Ever After, I can't remember, but I do kind of vaguely remember it. So that's perhaps sort of an example of a movie that is a little bit like the fairy tale, but it's told from the female perspective. Gosh, still have so many questions. I want to make sure I'm not going to just dominate with all my questions. You said something, because I do love the way you structure the book, the romance of friendship. I mean, not the romance, the Dharma of friendship, the Dharma of romance, and the Dharma of family. So the first section more about friendship, and I think you make this point, and I'm not going to say it as well as you do, but something about making friends with yourself. That before you can make friends in any way, whether that's in that romance and that relationship or with your family, that you have to make friends with yourself first, which from a Buddhist perspective might be make friends with your mind.
Right.
Right. And that in doing so, you encounter, you talk about the rodents of unusual size and the pitfall of despair, which those of you who remember the movie, right? Remember the rodents of unusual size with those really campy kind of rodent costumes, but that we have our minds encounter the rodents and our minds encounter the pitfall of despair or the cliffs of despair or whatever it is, in the process of making peace with ourselves in our own minds.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's interesting because meditation is so popular now. It's like the last 10 years, it's just exploded. And, I went from sort of, being the quirky kid who had Buddhist parents in my, progressive elementary school in New York City to all of a sudden, like everybody's like, yeah, I meditate. But there's still this pervading view that the purpose of doing meditation is to like, stop thinking, right, to almost like kill the mental noise. And people usually find, I mean, it definitely creates a little bit more space in between our thoughts, but people find that what actually happens is you're actually with your mental flow of self-criticism, of confusion, of distraction, of, all kinds of uncomfortable emotions, and you're with it much more intimately. And so, there's two words from the Buddhist languages for what meditation is. And the first is like, it's cultivating something, right? Like it has a sense of bhavana is this word in Sanskrit that has a sense of like gardening, right? You're kind of tending a garden. You're bringing out these qualities of generosity and kindness and a little bit more space in between impulse and reaction, which I think, God, wouldn't that be great if just every leader in our world just had that training of like, just you have an impulse and you just can create space and then say, there's a
little moment there after the impulse where if you can hold that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other is familiarization is the Tibetan word for meditation. Gom literally means to familiarize yourself. And so it's not about killing your thoughts. It's not about kind of deadening the mind. It's about like really understanding how thought and emotion and perception works. And you really have to like come to like your mind to want to do it. And I don't mean like as in like fetishize or like, cling to, but just sort of, you have to just appreciate yourself, And so those would be like, I think of long-term meditators, like the two qualities I really look for in myself and in others is one is if there is more space created. There's many different meditation techniques, but is there a little bit more space between the impulse and the reaction, which doesn't mean, I live in New York City, everybody moves fast here, but so you can still move through you can still get things done, but there's just a kind of mental attitude of non-reactivity, right? You're actually responding to situations rather than reacting to them. That's the way I heard one Buddhist teacher put it that I really like. And the other is an increase in sense of humor, because when you really start to see what it is to be human and to have a mind, it's fascinating, and it's like the mind is kind of hilarious, and that's why I think, funny things or things that are both poignant and kind of funny are very Buddhist to me. Most of the things I like that I have a real nostalgia for, like Princess Bride, share this quality of like intense poignancy mixed with like lightheartedness, because I do think you can't really take yourself too seriously and spend quite a lot of time with yourself. That's, I think, what people figure out. You're just going to drive yourself crazy, So you have to develop a kind of appreciation that's both loving, friendly, etc. And so in The Road Home, I said, not really a fan of Facebook these days, but it's a good refrain that meditation is about accepting your own friend request. Oh,
I love that. That's really good. Gotta remember that. I love what you said about humor too, because it's like I follow people on Instagram and other accounts, right? Zen accounts and Buddhist accounts, and it can be so serious. It can be so, sometimes there can be a lot of, it's about sereneness and calm and equanimity, which are all obviously good things and important Buddhist concepts. But sometimes what I love are the accounts that are almost irreverent and humorous and really don't take themselves too seriously.
Yeah. And that's another thing about Buddhist or spiritual or social media or mindfulness influencers is there's not enough humor. I sometimes get myself into trouble because I try to bring a little bit of humor as well into the space, and whenever that is met with like, shouldn't this be a space for like Dharma or deep spirituality, and you're like, what do you think humor is?
Yeah, exactly. Hey, let me get a question in from our audience. Melissa, a friend of mine actually, Melissa, who has a Buddhist practice too, has a question. So I'm going to read it from the chat. It says, the Buddhist teachings seem to de-emphasize the question of relationships, and particularly romantic relationships, of course, because the audience were monastics. So she's asking, how would you characterize the Buddhist attitude towards romance for a Western audience?
Yeah. There's actually, so this is interesting because this is where kind of a cultural narrative and personality, I think, matter a lot. So first of all, when you're looking at the founder of the tradition, I think this is really, what an amazing example of somebody who's like really trying to, at all costs, wake up. That's what the Buddha, 2,600 years ago, like he was willing, nothing else mattered other than figuring out the problem of ignorance and suffering and getting free of that, and he was willing to give up everything else in life, and I think that's when somebody is like single-pointedly focused, it's really powerful. At the same time, I think a modern psychologist, if there was a psychotherapist who was trained in, for example, attachment theory, looked at him, they'd say, this is an avoidant personality. This is a guy who cannot take the world and flee, literally leaves his wife and baby son. And so I think when you actually, and this might be a little bit blasphemous, but I think the story of the Buddha represents one path of awakening, and it does represent that world avoidant path of awakening. Obviously, he comes back to the world and teaches great meditation and spiritual teaching. So, I mean, he's amazing, but I think there are other paths. And I also think there's a lot of really bad translations into English of Buddhist concepts that were mostly done in the mid, like 1950s, 1960s by academics, not by people who were meditating and working with things, very directly. And so this notion of being detached, or rejecting the world becomes very prominent in a lot of the early translations, where really what Buddhism is drawing out, I think, related to romantic desire and dating or partnership or, marriage or marriage, to put it in the Princess Bride, marriage, in the Princess Bride language, is if we don't understand the nature of desire, we are going to suffer, because there's always this longing in desire that if it fixates on the object and tries to hold the object still, it's going to miss reality, right? And that's the danger with any kind of desire. That could be desire for a cookie, that could be desire for a person, that could be desire for status in the world. The danger is that rather than actually being able to be present and love the other being, you actually start to want them to be a certain way, and you fixate and you grasp. And as soon as you grasp, there's almost like and I think we have to practice, like, that's the thing, you can't throw words at this, like detachment or, desire is suffering. It's a feeling associated. There's a grasping, almost paralyzed quality. You can feel yourself when a partner, let's say, you're disappointed, your expectations are disappointed by something, let's say your romantic partner does, right? And you notice this kind of paralyzed, like holding on to what you wanted or what you thought it was supposed to be. And that is what we say is, one of the major, if not the cause of dissatisfaction, is that holding on quality when people and situations are ever changing and reality is actually more fluid than that. But if we were going to take a world embracing approach to this, I think you could make the argument maybe romantic relationships, for those of us who want them or feel this way, there's many different paths, could actually be a path to working directly with the nature of grasping. Because you get to actually, if you have a supportive situation and you have a good practice and have a sense of humor with yourself, now you get to start seeing grasping, and then that gap where maybe we just wait before we grasp, and you actually get to start to play in real time with it. The Buddha did it through deep meditation, which I think everybody who studies these teachings needs to have some relationship to contemplative practice and that sort of personal inner discipline. But it's amazing to think about, okay, now I'm going to work with the cause of suffering through this conversation, with my partner, or through this second date where I'm not sure if this person even is into me, and I have all kinds of nervous fixations about that and wanting something to happen, et cetera. And so for me, relationships have really been the path in a lot of ways. I do think everybody who gets serious about this stuff should go on, should spend a weekend on retreat or a week on retreat. So I think we can, in sort of micro doses, replicate the Buddha's, like, leaving the world behind and having some deep periods of working with ourselves. I think that's really important for any contemplative or spiritual tradition. But ultimately, I think for me, the main path, and this is in Buddhist history, when you look at the ideal of the Bodhisattva, which is the being who tries to generate compassion and awakening through relationship and tries to work for the benefit of sentient beings, which means you have to exist in relationship to sentient beings, which means sentient beings are gonna expose all the places your heart and mind are fixated, So I'm a blasphemous Buddhist who really likes the historical Buddha, but thinks we also need a lot more examples of people who go through a spiritual path in a world embracing manner rather than a world avoidant or monastic or retreating manner.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I think that, personally speaking, I think that idea of relationships is a practice, and you mentioned that I think in your book, that relationships are a practice, and I think that's where a lot of wisdom can come from. And I think about this idea between detachment and non-attachment, sort of. Like, I think, and I've talked to my teachers about this too. It's like, it's not that we're not supposed to be attached to each other, because to be detached is not to engage in human relationship. The idea is to not attach in a clinging sort of a way. So if I'm clinging, then I'm causing suffering for myself and perhaps with others. But if I can, and I know you're even talking about it is ridiculous, because as you said, it's about experiencing, not talking. But this idea that I'm not detached, like I'm Buddhist or spiritual, and I don't do relationships, sort of this image of the Siddhartha, of sort of going off into the wilderness. We have to have relationships with people. It's important for ourselves. And how do we do that in such a way that we maintain our understanding of who we are, and not get wrapped up in attaching to who others see us being?
Yeah.
I want to ask another, that's just me rambling. I want to ask another question here from a person who's logged in. This person says, how does Count Rugen, who is the six-fingered man, right?
Yes.
Christopher Guest character, fit into this interpretation? Is he just a metaphor for suffering or something more?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's kind of the manifestation of hatred and aggression and cruelty in the movie. I mean, he Humperdinck is kind of ignorant and but Rugen is really like the guy who would slash a little boy's face, the guy who would kill the man who made this amazing sword for him, and so he's really a bad guy, and there's not a lot of nuance there. Some things that I think are interesting about this, it's always interesting to think about what we share with whoever we perceive as the bad guy, so the fact that, my dad's best friend, and there's actually a great podcast for people who want to listen. Jamie Lee Curtis, who's Christopher Guest's wife, has a podcast called Good Friends. And she had Christopher and my dad, David, on her most recent episode to talk about friendship. And it's a really interesting sort of hour-long conversation of sort of the Dharma of friendship, like what you share with a lifelong friend, what you don't share with a friend, how you connect with people. So I think that's like the bad guy is your father's best friend now, right? You can't take the hatred that seriously. And another example of this that I mentioned in the book. So I wanted to talk to Mandy Patinkin about it, and I was so grateful I got to. And he kind of treated me as if like he was my dad's best friend, even though he didn't know him. He talked to me for like 90 exuberant minutes and was so happy I was writing this book and super supportive. But the reason I wanted to talk to Mandy Patinkin was Mandy Patinkin had recently wrote an article in Time magazine, specifically because one of the biggest Princess Bride fans in the world is Senator Ted Cruz of Texas.
I saw that.
And so you either like, not many people like Ted Cruz. I think I get the sense that even the people who voted for him didn't really like him, as he's not a super likable person. He's got a lot of kind of disingenuous. But if you want, he could
have been the six-fingered man. He could have been a little bit.
I mean, he is. I think Mitch McConnell might be more the six-fingered man, but anyway, we'll save that. We'll save discussion.
Another offline
for another time.
Yeah.
But so you can go online and if you can stand it, there's these amazing, like in the early days of the 2016 presidential election, before Mr. Trump destroyed Ted Cruz's presidential aspirations, he's like doing all these like the editorial board interview with like the Oklahoma City newspaper, and he's doing all of his Princess Bride impressions, and they're really good, And so Mandy Patinkin finds out that he loved the Princess Bride and wrote this article in Time about like basically what he thought Ted Cruz was completely misinterpreting the Princess Bride. So I really want to talk to Mandy Patinkin about that. And it reminded me of this sort of adage from the Bodhisattva path, the path of compassion towards all beings, even those we disagree with. There was this quote by Chogyam Trungpa that if you want to open your heart to somebody, you find out what you love in common with them. And his quote is like, everybody loves something, even if it's only tortillas. And applying that to Ted Cruz, everybody loves something, even if it's only the Princess Bride, you know, and so when I'm watching him, you know, I think Ted Cruz would beat me at a debate, by the way. He's a very smart person, but there's no actual principle he's upholding other than power itself when he's talking. But I can see there's a little boy in there who really loved this movie. And I was a little boy, you know, I think he was a little bit older than me, but, you know, and there's that quality of humanity kind of comes through. And I think that's also what Count Rugen represents for me, is it's like the worst villain is actually, you know, my dad's best friend, you know, so kind of locating yourself and like, who is actually the bad guy, who is the good guy, doesn't mean you give power to people you think are using it in a confused way, but from a Buddhist standpoint, but it means you can open your heart, you know, and still see the humanity of somebody that you think is just really not who you wish they were, right?
Yeah, that would, yes. And keep the questions coming. We have about 7 or 8 minutes, everyone. So if you've been meaning to ask a question, please drop it in the chat. Let's talk, if you don't mind, about the third part of the book, which is the Dharma Family. You know, and you said family is our practice. Maybe I'm paraphrasing you. I'm sorry if I am, Ethan. The family is our practice more than any other relationship. How do we awaken into compassion for our family members? Because I think that is by far the stickiest. I know it is for me personally. The stickiest territory to remain sort of compassionate and calm and centered is our family relationships.
Yeah. For sure. And I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And this is where I think, you know, I'm always really a big fan of the intersection between Buddhist philosophical and psychological thought and Western psychology. And those two kind of fields have really merged, you know, in ways that I remind people, anytime you see the word mindfulness, that's Buddhism. And it's not a religion, but mindfulness doesn't come anywhere but from Buddhism. And so whenever that's mixed with therapy, it's, you know, you see the intermingling of these. And I think a big leg up that's been really meaningful to me about Western psychology is when you do get to actually explore the karma, so to speak, of your formative relationships, you know, and we all, you know, you can sit and do like a loving kindness meditation or a compassion meditation and wish compassion for all sentient beings, and then go to Thanksgiving, and it all feels like it just goes out the window, right?
Totally,
out the window. Yes. You know, and I think that's because it's so sort of internal. It's so in our blind spot. It's so important to us, and it's so in our blind spot what our family, you know, means to us. Obviously, parental relationships, but just the entire idea of family. And so, you know, just the movie, just linking this formative moment for me, and talking about the last time I saw, you know, my grandfather in my apartment, which he came kind of by surprise. We would always go to his apartment for Sunday brunch. And this was before, basically my grandfather had mid to late stage Parkinson's, and he was a pediatrician turned child psychiatrist. And he and his wife basically decided to end it together, and because too much pain, you know, and they basically had this amazing night where they it's really, I mean, it's traumatic, but it's also kind of beautiful in a way. They basically had like a Romeo and Juliet night in their apartment, and knew which meds to take to go relatively painlessly. And their cleaning lady came in Monday morning and found them basically in bed, dressed in, you know, to the nines of elegant evening wear. And you know, that happened like 6 months after this movie came out. And so, yeah, I mean, and there's so much there when you look at like the mind, you know, you're actually in a way, you're thinking your parents' thoughts, right? You're hearing your parents' voice. and then you're passing that down, and so family is incredibly important. And I think we just need a lot of compassion, because even if you feel like you are progressing spiritually or you are finding that gap, as my dad once said, the reason your family can push all your buttons is because they installed them. I'm not sure if he actually said that, but he might be quoting somebody. And you have to have a lot of compassion for yourself and them. And it is the most difficult practice. Yeah. I haven't really met a person who hasn't said their family, they might say, no, I have a very supportive relationship with, my children or my parents or, the larger family. I also think in this political era, it's a really powerful moment, because the politics of our day are tearing families apart, and to be able to say, okay, I disagree with you, but I can still actually work with the feelings and generate compassion. Much easier said than done, but it's powerful practice. But I think if you're going to go into Thanksgiving and try to be whatever, a good Buddhist or mindful or, compassionate, it's going to be hard work, and it's going to be harder work than you think it's going to be. And that's because all of that early karma lives in those relationships, and it's activated in ways we don't know that it's going to be activated. So family is very powerful spiritually.
It makes me think too how storytelling is so central to family too, because it's just like the grandson and the grandfather in the movie, he's reading a story to his son, the Princess Bride, and there's that bonding. And in stories, you can be at the Thanksgiving table and they're about to be arguing over politics perhaps, but then one of the uncles all of a sudden tells a story from his childhood, and everything goes away, all the animosity goes away, and everyone's sitting in rapt attention listening to a family story. There's something about, I think, too, how stories and storytelling makes its way through generations and families. And of course, that can create our own stories, sort of family karma, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. We start believing our family stories maybe more than just trying to accept them as having been something at a time, but maybe as no longer applicable to us.
Right.
But we tend to internalize those stories and kind of create identities around them and stuff. But I don't know, I think it's just really interesting.
Yeah, me too.
We got 2 minutes. And I guess the last thing I'll say real quick, one last question for me, it's about family too. The family that's not our family, like the Fezzik, Inigo, and Wesley trio. It's like sometimes our family, that the movie tends to tell me too, that sometimes our family is not our blood family, but the family we make.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And that's, I think that's also true of romantic partnerships, is you're taking somebody who's not your family and making that sort of connection with them, and sometimes creating new family, right, with them. And I do think that human beings are, because of this deep karma, I do think people are really organized around family. I really feel like that's, and I feel like that's how we understand ourselves. And also, I think the politics of the day is also about sort of different notions of who is in our family, and I think that's very, it's very powerful to start to think about spiritual family, in Buddhist thought, this is the notion of Sangha, or community, that those who are aspiring to awaken with you, who you can develop bonds with. Not always that one's Buddhist community or Sangha is that we want to be around those people very much. It's just as irritating as any other set of relationships. But I do think there's something about generating compassion for all beings that is about expanding the notion of family. And I think that's going to be super important if our society is going to survive and thrive deep into the 21st century. I think we're going to have to increase the notion of who's in our family.
Yeah. Thank you, Ethan. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking time out to meet with us. I want to also remind everyone that here in a moment, I believe, after we sign off, The movie The Princess Bride will be available to stream and to watch. The link is in the chat there if you're looking for it. The book is available, I think, also through a link in the chat. Please be sure and pick it up. It's a terrific, terrific read, Ethan. Thank you to CALS and to the sponsors of CALS. There's a millage vote coming up, and my personal 2 cents here is make sure in November support your Central Arkansas library system and the millage vote, because we need our public libraries and we need programs like these. So if you can get out, I believe it's November 9th, don't quote me, I've forgotten the exact date. It's coming up here, first week of November or so. Please get out and vote and support CALS. Ethan, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. Yeah, thank you. And if anybody wants to be in touch with me, you can just go to ethannichtern.com and my contact's right there. So
terrific. Great. Thank you. Appreciate you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, all.
Bye.